Lord Christ.
In the name of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Go ahead and be seated. Have you ever been asked a question and you know you're resolving a dispute? Many of us have. You walk into a room and someone holds up something and they say, like, what color is this? And you're like, uh-oh. And you see that, a husband and a wife looking at each other, waiting for your response. And you're kind of like, I don't know. I don't want to answer this question. It looks like a trap, right? And what we're entering into now, when you read this gospel, is a story a lot like that. It's a lot like Jesus is entering into a trap. They kind of laid out a trap for him. They're asking a question that seems rather simple. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But this is a loaded time and a loaded question. And so this trap is laid out as really an impossible question for Jesus to answer. It starts out, so Matthew doesn't leave us to wonder the motivation behind the question. In verse 15, he tells us that, right? He tells us that they're attempting to trap Jesus in his words, right? They say, let's trap Jesus in his words. And so Matthew kind of lays out the picture for us. And we don't know whether Jesus knows it's a trap or not, or at least he doesn't lay it out. We know that Jesus can figure these things out quickly, but when Matthew lays out the narrative, he's gonna leave us guessing, right? He's gonna leave us wondering, does Jesus know it's a trap? And so they come, and it's the Pharisees and the Herodians. This is an alliance between groups that you wouldn't expect. The Pharisees and the Herodians walking up to ask Jesus this question. So they're in the land, right? They're in the land that God gave them, the Israelites. God has given them this land, and yet they're in this land, and it is ruled by a foreign power who is oppressive to them. This is the land that God has promised his people, and they're in it, and yet led by this oppressive group. So you have this group, you have this real problem here that different groups tried to handle in different ways. The Pharisees can be represented by a guy, Josephus talks about a guy named Judas, not the famous Judas that's in our scriptures, but Judas, a Galanite of a city whose name was Gamala, who took with him Sadduc, a Pharisee, became zealous to draw them to a revolt, who both said that this taxation was no better than an introduction to slavery, and exhorted the nation to assert their liberty. So one response to this would have been embodied by groups like the Pharisees, which is, you don't pay this tax to this foreign leader in the land that God gave us. That's like slavery. So we're not paying this tax. A lot like it. This was a lot of the quotes of our national revolution, right? No taxation without representation. And a lot of it was, hey, you pay taxes to this foreign ruler. It's like being enslaved. Don't be enslaved. Don't pay taxes to a foreign ruler. That's exactly one of the positions of the groups that were around. And the Pharisees was one of them. On top of that, though, you have the Herodians. The Herodians would have said, how foolish it is to end up in a revolution over this. How foolish it would be to not submit to the rulers that are here, to pay them the tax, and to not end up in a fight that we can't win because they have guns. How foolish would you be to say, hey, we would rely on God to deliver us from these foreign rulers when they don't have guns then, but when they have the swords, when they have the chariots, when they have all the power, they have all the might and all the strength. And why would we rely on God? That would be foolish. And we would all end up dead, people that would rely on God. And for all that don't get political comments that people give pastors, especially at this time of year, right? We're probably dealing with the most overtly political passage in the Gospels. Besides the crucifixion itself, you have that beautiful picture of Jesus before Pontius Pilate saying things like, you have no authority that God didn't give you, right? So that might be the most political passage in the Gospels. But this is second to that. you have this really heightened, they're basically asking Jesus for a hot take, and a hot take that no one's going to be pleased with, and a hot take that's a trap, really. Because if Jesus says what you might expect him to say as a Jewish man, being oppressed by a foreign ruler in the land that God has given them, and says don't pay the taxes, you have a group of Herodians there that are ready to go report his response to Roman authorities, right? And so it's a trap. He's in a real difficult situation. See, things are, and this is what's tough, is things are really not how they're supposed to be. In this situation that Jesus finds himself in the first century, led by the Romans in the land God gave them, this is not how it's supposed to be. It's broken. It's not right. Something needs to give, and something needs to be fixed. It's not just. It's not fair. And yet, there's still some obligation that we would have to people in authority, even in the context of a place where things are not how they're supposed to be, right? So Jacques Ellul said this: on the one hand, it is impossible for us to make this world less sinful. On the other hand, it is impossible for us to accept it as it is. And this is the difficulty that we find ourselves in, being the people of God at any time, in any place, and certainly being the people of God in this time, in this place, when the Pharisees and the Herodians, who should not have been cooperating and had every reason to hate each other, all of a sudden stood up. They were united in their common enemy. Isn't that normal, right? So they found a common enemy, Jesus, and then they asked him for a hot take: do we pay taxes to Caesar or not? And here we are. And so we see this trap that's been laid out. Next movement we see in the text is Jesus' response. And what's interesting about Jesus' response is that he perfectly agrees with and refutes both groups. He agrees with them, and yet he comes at them and refutes them. So he does this by asking, whose image and likeness is on this coin? He's using charged language, Jewish language. He says, whose image? The Greek word in this text is icon. That's the word that the Greek Septuagint would use to translate that Genesis 1:26, that passage we would know, right? That when God says, let us make man in our own image. Let us make man in our own image and after our own likeness, when God's saying that. And he says, whose image is on this coin? Pulling that language on purpose, language that they would have known, that they were familiar with, particularly the Pharisees would have been familiar with that language. He was speaking Aramaic. He would have been speaking language that was more closely related to directly what Genesis 1:26 was written in. And he says, whose image is on the coin? Bring it to me. And ultimately points out that you give things to people or to whoever has their image on it. That image is a sign of ownership. That image is a sign. And so he takes this denarius and he says, whose image is on it? And they say, Caesar's. So he says, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but give to God the things that are God's. In other words, whose image do you bear? Whose image and whose likeness are you made in? Maybe we don't worry so much about the coin, and we worry about giving ourselves and our very lives to God. St. Hilary, the 4th century bishop, says, it behoves us also to render unto God the things that are his, namely, body, soul, and will. For Caesar's coin is in the gold in which his image was portrayed. That is God's coin on which the divine image is stamped. Give therefore your money to Caesar, but preserve a conscience void of offense for God. And so Jesus is giving this answer that's going to come at both these groups that are before him. One, he's going to come at the revolutionaries, right? Those that would say, no, you don't pay the tax to the foreign ruler. And he would tell them, he would agree with them, first of all. He would say, it is right that they trust in God clearly, and that they're the people that are clearly articulating the brokenness in this world system, that are saying, this is broken, this isn't how things are supposed to be, that are naming that brokenness, that aren't getting too comfortable with the world systems. You know, he would say, that is right. Right on. But then he would say to them, you have obligations and duties to those who are in authority over you in this broken world that you find yourself in. So you would look to those, and that's probably people like me. So maybe when you look at the brokenness of the world system, if you find yourself more likely to want to name the brokenness and rebel and flip the tables over and say it's all messed up, God will look at you and say, that's right. It is messed up. It is broken. Don't make peace with the current world system. It's not something to be making peace with. But he would challenge people like me too. And he would say, yeah, even in the world system that we're in, broken as it is, unjust as it is, unfair as it is, you have some obligation to the people in authority over you. And I think St. Paul in Romans 13 was considering some of that. Or St. Peter, who would have been here for this teaching when he wrote 1 Peter 2, he would have been thinking about that. Verses 13 through 17, he would have been thinking those same thoughts. So, hey, what are the obligations I have to rulers to submit to the people who are put in authority over me, even in a broken system? He also, though, would have turned toward the comfortable, and he would have done a very similar thing to those who had made themselves comfortable with the world system, those Herodians who had said, how foolish it would be to trust in God to deliver us. Why don't we make peace with the people who are ruling over us? They have the chariots. They have the swords. They're bigger and stronger than us. We can't win. How foolish you would be to say, trust in God and rebel. We'll just be dead people that trust in God. Right? I think he would look at them, first of all, and challenge them and say, how dare you think it foolish to trust in God? How dare you be so wise in your own eyes that you would make peace with the world system as it is? Is there a God in Israel, you would say? Is there a God that's... the Psalms over and over would say, some trust in horses, some trust in chariots, but we trust in the living God. He is our deliverer. You know, the Bible is not particularly comfortable with governmental authorities. I don't know if you know that. So 1 Samuel 8 is like the first place we see a strong criticism of rulers and governmental authorities. The people ask for a king. They want to be like the other nations, and they ask for a king. And the prophet Samuel comes at them and says, if you have a king, he's going to tax you, he's going to take a bunch of your crops, and he's going to finance his army, he's going to do all the things rulers do. And don't you want God to be your king instead of this king? And they wanted to be like the other nations, and it didn't end up working out well for them. The kings were every bit as evil and as wicked as the prophet Samuel had warned them. The king Saul was the first one, right? And every bit as wicked and as pragmatic and as sinful and as compromising as any of them, right? We have Daniel and Esther, where we see people like the Israelites in the first century were ruled by foreign leaders, and they were called on by God to disobey the law of the land they were in. Both Daniel and Esther. Jesus tells Pilate he has no authority except what God has given to him. And Revelation 18 shows that people are the people that are too comfortable with the world systems when Babylon is fallen are the people who are weeping and said, we made ourselves wealthy off of her wares. The Bible's not particularly excited about governing authorities, because ultimately our allegiance is not to our country, or to a political party, but to God. Our ultimate allegiance is to no other, and not even to our own family, and not even, like, our ultimate allegiance and obligation belongs to God and to God alone. Even that 1 Peter passage that I brought up, it says, fear God, honor the emperor. Fear God, honor the emperor. Okay. So we honor governmental authorities, but we do not put our trust in them. We do not put our trust in them for direction or for protection, for deliverance. We honor them as people that God has appointed to lead us, but we don't put our trust in them. And that's a strong critique of what we're very tempted to do at election season. If this guy gets in, we're going to be okay, and if this guy gets in, we're done. We're done for. And we're very tempted toward that. And Jesus, looking at these two groups that are coming to him and asking for a hot take, and a hot take that was a trap, right? That he looks at them and he says, yes. He critiques the revolutionaries and says, yes, you have some obligation to the people who are put in authority over you. But he critiques those who would make too much peace too. And he says, don't trust in them. Don't put your trust in the ones that have the chariots. And don't put your trust in them. Trust only in God. Trust only in God. So I think here's the call for us today. I think it's to give to everyone whatever they are due. But ultimately, you and I belong to God. Whose image is on the coin? Caesar's. Fine. Whose image is on your and my life? God's. Give the coin to Caesar. Fine. Give your whole life to God. Right? It reminds me a little bit of Romans 13, verse 7. Another place where we see these things dealt with in our relationship with authority laid out. I just wanted to read that verse for you. So this is at the end of when he talks about submitting to governmental authorities, but he says, pay to all whatever is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. The disposition of the Christian is just give to anyone whatever is due to them, and nothing more than what is due to them, because our ultimate allegiance comes from God. Our catechism actually links this submission to governmental authorities with the fifth commandment. With the fifth commandment where it says, honor your father and your mother. That fifth commandment, and it says this leads us into the disposition we're supposed to have toward government authorities. This situation that we're reading in the Gospels is political, but the call to give to anyone whatever they're due extends far beyond politics. Our parents, our spiritual authorities, our spouses, when we're called to submit to one another out of reverence to Christ, right? Our employees, our employers. We give to everyone whatever is their due. We're called to be people that give people what they're due. But we never, ever forget who we truly belong to. We don't belong to any of those groups. Go campaign for your favorite candidate. Go for it. Hold the sign. Yell in the street. But don't forget who you really belong to. You don't belong to them. You're not even on their team. When they screw it up, which they will, I promise they will. So when they do, you can go ahead and critique them. Feel free. You don't belong to them. You're not on their team. Go campaign for them. Go yell in the streets, and then remember who you truly belong to. And it's to God Almighty, because we bear His image, and we're in His likeness. Unlike the coin that bared Caesar's image. Hey, Grace, you need to go sit. That's my girl. We bear His image, and we're in His likeness. So God calls us to be good citizens. He doesn't call us to be the type of people that delight in rebellion. And He does want us to overcome this rebellious streak that's in us that kind of likes when it's time to rebel against authority, right? But that being said, he never wants us to get too comfortable with his power structures in this world. He wants us to realize that while we owe them honor and obedience in some matters, ultimately we don't belong to them. Governments have no ability to grant value or rights or to bestow them on us. They only can simply recognize the rights and value that God has already given us. That's why at our best as a country, we were recognizing when we said in our founding documents, in the Declaration of Independence, we were endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. We were recognizing that it's not government that gives rights or that can give value. All the government can do is recognize rights God has already given us. Our rights and our value are God-given, and they're not based on any relationship with secular nation states. Similarly, we don't belong to governments or authorities or even ultimately to our spouses or to our families. They aren't the groups that have ultimate claim on our lives. God owns our lives. And when we give to others what they're due, we're doing that because of our primary relationship with Most High God, who owns us, who created us, who redeemed us with his Son's blood. So give to everyone what they're due, but most importantly, give your very life to God. He has the ultimate claim on your life. Amen.